But where did the bodies of the unfortunate victims of the Titanic disappear to? On the night of April 15, 1912, as the stern of the great liner vanished beneath the icy waves of the North Atlantic, over 1,500 passengers were left to their tragic fate in waters below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Only a little over 700 people found refuge in lifeboats and were rescued at dawn by the RMS Carpathia, yet strangely, its captain reported seeing only one body floating on the surface. However, other ships passing through the area days later claimed to have seen hundreds of bodies adrift. In fact, over 300 remains were recovered from the sea by several vessels, most notably the Mackay Bennett, specially commissioned for this grim task. How can we explain this mysterious phenomenon? What became of all those bodies? What can we learn about these mortuary ships whose stories have been overshadowed by the Titanic's enduring legacy? Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where we delve into the obscure and forgotten chapters of history, and today we'll uncover the untold saga of the Mackay Bennett, the last chapter of the Titanic. To unravel the mystery of the missing bodies, we must first revisit the tragic events of that fateful night. The RMS Titanic was the largest and most luxurious ocean liner of its time, embarking on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City in April 1912. A marvel of engineering, it was hailed as unsinkable due to its advanced safety features. On board were over 2,200 passengers and crew members, representing a cross-section of society, from wealthy magnates and celebrities traveling in first class, to immigrants seeking a new life in America, packed into third class. Despite its grandeur, the Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough to accommodate about half of those on board. This shortage wasn't due to negligence but was, shockingly, in compliance with the maritime regulations of the time. These outdated laws based lifeboat requirements on the ship's tonnage rather than its passenger capacity. The prevailing belief was that a ship as advanced as the Titanic was its own lifeboat. On the night of April 14, 1912, under a moonless sky, the Titanic was cruising at near full speed across the icy waters of the North Atlantic. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout spotted an iceberg directly in the ship's path. Despite frantic efforts to steer clear, the starboard side scraped along the massive ice, tearing a series of holes below the waterline. As water poured into the breached compartments, it became clear that the ship was doomed. The crew began evacuating passengers into the lifeboats, but with insufficient space for all, tough decisions had to be made. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic's stern rose high into the air before the ship broke apart and disappeared beneath the waves. The total darkness of the moonless night enveloped over 1,500 people, left stranded in the freezing ocean. This catastrophic event not only shocked the world, but also set the stage for the enduring mysteries that would follow. Mysteries like the fate of those left behind in the icy abyss. As the Titanic vanished beneath the waves, over 1,500 people were left adrift in the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. The sea that night was a deadly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, or -2 degrees Celsius. Unlike fresh water, the salt in seawater lowers its freezing point, allowing it to remain liquid even below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Immersion in such frigid temperatures is perilous. The sudden cold shock can cause an involuntary gasp, leading to the inhalation of water. The body's natural response includes rapid hyperventilation and an accelerated heartbeat. Panic quickly sets in as limbs become numb and unresponsive due to the intense cold. Most victims lose consciousness within 10 to 15 minutes from hypothermia. The body's core temperature drops rapidly, leading to heart failure and death within 30 to 45 minutes. Even those wearing life jackets faced grim odds. The flotation devices kept them above water but couldn't protect them from the lethal cold. Yet, amid this tragedy, there were extraordinary tales of survival. Charles John Juin, the ship's chief baker, is one such story. Remarkably, he is said to have survived in the icy waters for nearly 2 hours before finding refuge on an overturned lifeboat. How did he manage this incredible feat? Juin later attributed his survival to the substantial amount of alcohol he consumed that night, which he believed insulated him against the cold. While alcohol can create a sensation of warmth, it actually lowers the body's core temperature. His survival was more likely due to his constant movement in the water, which may have delayed the onset of hypothermia. Juin's story is a rare exception. For the vast majority, the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic proved swiftly fatal. The sea claimed their lives with a merciless efficiency, leaving little hope for rescue. As chaos engulfed the sinking Titanic, the lifeboats became the only hope for survival. Although there were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board, the crew worked swiftly to load as many passengers as possible. Life jackets were distributed massively, offering a slim chance against the freezing waters. However, in the panic and confusion, many lifeboats were launched half-empty. The fear of being sucked under by the sinking ship prompted officers to order the lifeboats to row away quickly. In the darkness, the screams and pleas of those left behind filled the air, a haunting chorus of desperation. Despite these cries for help, most lifeboats did not return to rescue survivors. There were several reasons for this heartbreaking decision. Many feared that their lifeboats would be overturned by the sheer number of people trying to climb aboard. The image of hundreds of desperate individuals swarming a small boat was terrifying. Additionally, lack of experienced sailors meant that some lifeboats were poorly managed, making maneuvering difficult in the dark. Only a few brave souls chose to act differently. Lifeboat number 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, stands out as a beacon of courage. After transferring passengers to other lifeboats to lighten his load, Lowe and his small crew returned to the wreck site in search of survivors. They managed to pull a handful of people from the frigid waters, some of the very few rescued after the ship went down. Similarly, Lifeboat number 4 returned to the debris field and rescued a few more individuals. But sadly, these efforts were exceptions, rather than the rule. One of the survivors pulled from the icy sea was Frank Prentice, an assistant purser on the Titanic. He later recounted the eerie silence that fell after the screams faded, a silence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The water was so cold it was like 1,000 knives stabbing you all over your body, survivors recalled. The reluctance of most lifeboats to return remains one of the most poignant and controversial aspects of the tragedy. The aftermath saw 706 survivors rescued by the Carpathia, but over 1,500 lives were lost. The sea that night became both a grave and a witness to unthinkable sorrow.
Talking about it, I should probably dream of that tonight. Have another nightmare. You'd think I'm too old for that, but you'd be amazed. You lie in bed at night and the whole thing comes round again.
In the early hours of April 15th, as the Titanic's distress signals faded into the cold night, the RMS Carpathia was racing against time. Captained by Arthur Henry Rostron, the Carpathia had received the Titanic's SOS calls and immediately changed course, pushing its engines beyond their limits to assist. Despite their efforts, they were still 58 miles away, a distance that would take several hours to cover. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, the Carpathia reached the outskirts of the disaster area. The crew and passengers were met with a chilling sight, darkness stretching across the horizon, dotted only by lifeboats bobbing in the frigid sea. The Titanic had already vanished beneath the waves, leaving no trace of its once grand silhouette. Captain Rostron and his crew sprang into action. The Carpathia navigated carefully among the lifeboats, bringing survivors aboard one by one. The process was meticulous and heartfelt. Blankets, hot drinks, and medical attention were provided immediately to those rescued. Survivors were in various states of shock, hypothermia, and grief. The rescue operation took over 4 hours, concluding around 8:30 in the morning. In total, 706 survivors were brought aboard the Carpathia. The sheer scale of the loss became increasingly apparent as lifeboat after lifeboat reported the devastating numbers. Despite the extensive search and rescue efforts, Captain Rostron reported seeing only one body floating among the wreckage. This observation was puzzling considering the vast number of people unaccounted for. Rostron later testified during the official inquiries, "We cruised around the area for some time, but apart from wreckage and that one body, there was nothing more we could do." Similarly, other crew members and surviving officers from the Titanic noted the absence of bodies in the immediate vicinity. This absence added a layer of mystery to an already unfathomable tragedy. Several factors might explain why so few bodies were seen that morning. The pre-dawn darkness combined with debris and small ice floes could have obscured visibility. Bodies wearing white life jackets might have been difficult to distinguish from the surrounding ice and wreckage. Ocean currents and wind could have dispersed the bodies away from the lifeboats and the Carpathia's search area. Bodies, being mostly submerged, would drift differently compared to floating debris. Also, aware of the fragile state of the survivors, Captain Rostron prioritized their care over searching for the deceased. Bringing bodies aboard could have further traumatized those already in shock. By mid-morning, with no more survivors to rescue, the Carpathia set course for New York City. Before departing, Captain Rostron held a service to honor both the rescued and the lost. Prayers were said, and a moment of silence was observed, a poignant tribute amid the vast expanse of the ocean. The Carpathia's arrival marked both an end and a beginning, the end of immediate rescue efforts and the beginning of a journey toward understanding and healing. Yet the mystery of the missing bodies lingered, prompting questions that would only intensify in the days to come. Despite the extensive efforts of the RMS Carpathia, the mystery remained. Where were the bodies of the Titanic's victims? With over 1,500 people unaccounted for, it seemed implausible that so few bodies were observed during the rescue operations. Just a few days after the sinking, other ships passing through the area began reporting harrowing sights. The German liners SS Bremen and SS Rhine both reported seeing hundreds of bodies floating in the water, many still clad in their life jackets. Passengers on the Bremen described heart-wrenching scenes, a woman clutching her baby, groups of people huddled together as if seeking comfort in their final moments, and individuals still dressed in their evening attire. These vivid accounts contrasted sharply with the Carpathia's reports. This stark difference in observations led to several theories attempting to explain the whereabouts of the bodies immediately after the disaster. Bodies in cold water often float low in the water, making them difficult to spot, especially in rough seas or among debris. On the night of the rescue, the sea was littered with icebergs and wreckage, which could have obscured bodies from view. The Gulf Stream and other ocean currents could have dispersed the bodies over a wide area. Additionally, wind drift affects floating objects differently based on their size and buoyancy. Bodies, being mostly submerged, would drift differently compared to lifeboats and larger debris, potentially moving them away from the main search areas. In cold water, the process of decomposition slows significantly. Bodies may initially sink due to the weight of soaked clothing but resurface days later as gases build up during decomposition. This could explain why bodies became more visible in the days following the sinking. It's possible that Captain Rostron and the crew of the Carpathia chose not to focus on recovering bodies, prioritizing the living over the dead. Bringing bodies aboard could have further traumatized the already distressed survivors. Rostron later admitted that his primary concern was the care and safety of the survivors, and he avoided unnecessary exposure to additional horrors. Survivors and crew members offered insights into the absence of bodies during the initial rescue. Second Officer James Bissett of the Carpathia suggested that bodies might have been present but difficult to distinguish amidst the ice and debris, especially in the low light conditions. Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger who survived, noted that as they approached the Carpathia, they saw wreckage and chunks of ice, but no bodies. He expressed surprise given the magnitude of the disaster. Major Arthur Puchin, a first-class passenger, was also astonished by the lack of bodies, stating that it seemed incredible not to see more evidence of the tragedy. The discrepancy between the immediate aftermath and the reports from ships passing days later adds a layer of complexity to the Titanic's tragedy. It underscores the vastness of the ocean and how quickly evidence can disperse or become concealed within it. As news of the disaster spread, families and officials recognized the importance of recovering the bodies, for both closure and legal reasons. This urgency set the stage for the mission of the Mackay Bennett, which would embark on a grim journey to retrieve the victims of the Titanic. In the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, the urgent need to recover the bodies of the victims became apparent. For the sake of grieving families seeking closure, and for legal and investigative purposes, the White Star Line, owner of the Titanic, took responsibility for organizing the recovery efforts. To undertake this grim task, the White Star Line chartered the CS Mackay Bennett, a cable-laying ship based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the closest major port to the disaster site. The ship's regular duties involved laying and repairing transatlantic telegraph cables, but now it was assigned a far more somber mission. The crew of the Mackay Bennett were offered double pay as an incentive for the difficult and emotionally taxing work ahead. Many of them were seasoned sailors, but few had experience with a recovery operation of such magnitude. The Mackay Bennett was hastily outfitted for its new role. The ship was loaded with all available embalming supplies from Halifax, including formalin and other preservatives, 100 coffins to accommodate bodies for transport back to land, 100 tons of ice to help preserve the remains during the voyage, canvas body bags and iron weights for those who would need to be buried at sea. Joining the crew was John R. Snow, a respected undertaker and embalmer from Halifax. His expertise would be crucial in the proper handling and preservation of the bodies. On April 17, 1912, the Mackay Bennett set sail under the command of Captain Frederick Harold Larnder. The journey to the disaster site would take several days, during which the crew prepared themselves mentally and physically for the arduous task ahead. The ship arrived in the area on April 20th, guided by coordinates and reports from other vessels that had passed through the wreck site. As dawn broke on April 21st, the crew was met with a haunting sight: bodies and debris scattered across the vast expanse of the ocean. The recovery operation commenced immediately. On the first day, the Mackay Bennett recovered 51 bodies, including men, women, and a few children. The process was painstaking and emotionally draining. Small boats were lowered to carefully retrieve the remains, which were then brought aboard for identification and preservation. The crew faced numerous challenges. Handling the remains of so many victims took a heavy psychological toll. Many crew members struggled with the grim reality of their task, confronting scenes of tragedy on an unprecedented scale. Despite bringing all available supplies, it quickly became apparent that the embalming fluids and coffins were insufficient for the number of bodies being recovered. Captain Larnder later reflected, "We were unprepared for the sheer number of the dead. We had taken all the embalming fluid in Halifax, but it wasn't nearly enough. Also, the North Atlantic waters were cold and often rough, making the recovery operations physically demanding and dangerous. The crew had to contend with the elements while performing delicate and respectful handling of the remains. Despite the hardships, the crew remained dedicated to their mission. They meticulously recorded details for each body recovered, assigned a unique number to each victim, documented personal effects found with the bodies such as jewelry, wallets, or identifiable clothing, noted physical descriptions to aid in later identification. These records were essential for identifying the victims and providing closure to their families. The presence of John R. Snow ensured that the remains were treated with as much dignity and care as possible under the circumstances. As the days went on, the crew of the Mackay Bennett continued their solemn work. The emotional weight of the mission was profound. One crew member wrote in his journal, "It is a scene I shall never forget. The sea, so vast and indifferent, holding so many lost souls. We do what we can, but it feels like a drop in the ocean." With resources dwindling and the number of recovered bodies increasing, Captain Larnder was forced to make difficult choices. Prioritization became necessary. For the first-class passengers, given priority for preservation and transport back to land, as they were more likely to be claimed by relatives who could afford burial expenses. And then, second- and third-class passengers and crew. Many were respectfully buried at sea due to the lack of embalming supplies and storage space. Short services were held, and prayers were offered as their bodies were committed to the ocean. These decisions, while practical, highlighted the social inequalities that persisted even in death, a somber reflection of the times. As the CS Mackay Bennett continued its grim task of recovering bodies from the Titanic disaster, the crew faced significant challenges, not just physical, but also ethical and logistical. Each body recovered was treated with as much dignity and care as possible under the circumstances. The crew implemented a systematic process to ensure proper documentation. Every body was assigned a unique identification number upon recovery. This number was crucial for record-keeping and correspondence with families. The crew carefully cataloged all personal belongings found with each victim. Items such as jewelry, wallets, letters, photographs, and clothing were documented and stored securely. Detailed descriptions of each item were noted, and where possible, the items were preserved to aid in identification and eventual return to relatives. Physical characteristics of each victim were recorded, including estimated age, height, hair color, eye color, and any distinguishing features like tattoos or scars. This meticulous documentation was intended to assist authorities and families in identifying the deceased. Despite their best efforts, the crew faced harrowing decisions due to limited resources. The Mackay Bennett quickly exhausted its supply of embalming fluids and coffins. Without proper preservation, bodies could not be transported back to land according to the health regulations of the time. The cold temperatures provided some natural preservation, but it was insufficient for the duration of the voyage. Faced with limited resources, Captain Larnder made the difficult decision to prioritize the bodies of first-class passengers for embalming and transport. This was partly because they were more likely to be identified and claimed by affluent families who could cover funeral expenses. Second- and third-class passengers as well as crew members were often buried at sea due to the lack of supplies. For many victims, especially those who were unidentified or were crew members, the only option was a respectful burial at sea. Short funeral services were conducted on deck. Prayers were read, and the bodies weighted with iron were gently lowered into the ocean. These ceremonies were solemn and heartfelt, with crew members paying their respects to the lost souls. The tragedy of the Titanic extended beyond the sinking itself, revealing stark social disparities that persisted even after death. The decisions made regarding which bodies to preserve highlighted the class distinctions of the era. First-class passengers received preferential treatment, while others were considered lower priority. This reflected the societal norms of the early 20th century, where social status often dictated the level of respect and resources one received. Many victims lacked identification documents, making it difficult to determine who they were. Language barriers also posed problems, as immigrants from various countries were among the passengers. Some crew members wore uniforms but others did not, complicating the identification process. For families of third-class passengers and crew, the likelihood of having their loved ones' bodies returned was slim. This lack of closure added to their grief. The disparity in treatment underscored the inequities that existed, prompting reflection and criticism in the aftermath. The crew of the Mackay Bennett did what they could under dire circumstances, but the ethical dilemmas they faced were a stark reminder of the societal divisions of the time. Their efforts, though constrained by limited resources, were carried out with as much compassion and respect as possible. As the ship's hold filled with the remains of the deceased, the weight of their task grew heavier, not just in physical terms, but in the emotional burden carried by each crew member. After days spent recovering bodies and performing sea burials, the Mackay Bennett was laden with the remains of those who would be returned to land. The ship set course back to Halifax, arriving on April 30, 1912. News of the ship's impending arrival had reached Halifax, and a somber mood enveloped the city. Families of the victims, officials, and citizens gathered at the docks, bracing themselves for the grim task of identifying and claiming their loved ones. The local authorities had prepared for the arrival by setting up temporary morgues, including the Mayflower curling rink, which was transformed to accommodate the remains. The bodies were carefully unloaded and transported to the designated facilities. Identification efforts continued on land, with officials using the meticulous records kept by the Mackay Bennett's crew. Families were invited to view personal effects and provide additional information that might aid in identifying the deceased. The people of Halifax demonstrated immense compassion, offering support to grieving families and assisting in any way they could. Funeral services were arranged and many victims were laid to rest in local cemeteries, such as the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, which became the final resting place for 121 Titanic victims. The conclusion of the Mackay Bennett's mission did not mark the end of recovery efforts, but it was a significant chapter in the Titanic's aftermath. Other ships like the CS Minia, CGS Montmagny, and SS Algerine were dispatched to continue searching for bodies. As weeks passed, fewer bodies were found, either due to decomposition, sinking, or dispersion by currents. The crew members of the Mackay Bennett and subsequent recovery ships often struggled with the emotional repercussions of their work. Many were haunted by the experiences, with some reporting nightmares and lingering sadness long after the mission ended. The efforts of these crews were crucial in providing closure for many families. However, their stories have often been overshadowed by the broader narrative of the Titanic's sinking. Today, there is a growing recognition of their contributions, acknowledging the humanity and compassion they displayed in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The return of the Mackay Bennett to Halifax marked a poignant moment in the Titanic's story, a convergence of loss, compassion, and the enduring human spirit. The city's role as the final destination for many of the disaster's victims solidified its place in this historic event. As the victims were laid to rest, the world grappled with the magnitude of the tragedy. The collective grief spurred changes in maritime safety regulations, but it also left an indelible mark on all who were touched by the disaster. As the city of Halifax became the final resting place for many of the Titanic's victims, it also became a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. The tragedy left an indelible mark not only on the survivors and the families of the victims, but also on the crew members who undertook the harrowing task of recovery. 121 victims of the Titanic are buried at Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax. The graves are arranged in gentle curves reminiscent of the hull of a ship, a silent tribute to the Maritime disaster. Each grave is marked with a simple gray granite headstone, many bearing only the date of the tragedy, April 15, 1912, and an assigned number corresponding to the records kept during recovery. Unidentified victims were laid to rest with markers that read, "Known unto God," or simply, their recovery number. The anonymity of these graves serves as a poignant reminder of the many lives whose stories ended abruptly and without recognition. Families who never recovered their loved ones' bodies often found solace in visiting these graves, embracing them as a place to mourn. Among the most touching graves is that of the unknown child, a marker that simply reads, "Erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic April 15, 1912. The crew of the Mackay Bennett was deeply moved upon recovering the body of a young boy, estimated to be around 2 years old. The sailors pooled their resources to provide a proper burial, and the child became a symbol of the innocence lost in the tragedy. Advances in DNA technology eventually led to the identification of the unknown child in 2007 as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old boy from England. The Goodwin family, consisting of Sidney, his parents, and 5 siblings, were all lost in the disaster while immigrating to America in hopes of a better life. The identification brought a sense of closure and poignancy to a story that had touched many over the decades. The recovery of the unknown child had a profound emotional effect on the crew of the Mackay Bennett. The image of the innocent victim stayed with them, symbolizing the human cost of the disaster beyond statistics and headlines. The grave of Sidney Leslie Goodwin continues to be a focal point for visitors, representing all the children who perished that night. For many families, the absence of a body made the process of grieving even more difficult. Without physical remains, some struggled with denial and unresolved grief, holding on to hope that their loved ones might somehow have survived. Memorial services were held without coffins, and empty graves were sometimes designated as symbolic resting places. The lack of a body also presented practical challenges. Death certificates were necessary for families to access life insurance benefits, settle estates, and receive financial support. The White Star Line provided some assistance, but many families faced bureaucratic hurdles in the absence of official proof of death. The story of the Mackay Bennett reveals a hidden chapter of the Titanic tragedy, one of compassion, duty, and the solemn efforts to honor those lost. While the sinking of the Titanic is etched in history, the courageous acts of those who recovered its victims deserve to be remembered. If this journey into the past resonated with you, please share this video and subscribe to Dark Chronicles for more untold stories from history's shadows. Thank you for watching. Until next time.